On the top floor of the Washington National Airport Control Tower, Controller Joe Zacco saw a strange object darting across his radar screen. It wasn't a bird, and it wasn't a plane. But what was it? He looked out of the window and saw a bright light hovering in the sky. He turned to his colleague, Assistant Control Tower Chief Howard Coughlin, who was sitting 3 feet away, and said, "Look at that bright light. If you believe in flying saucers, that could definitely be one." And then the light took off, darting away with incredible speed. From July the 12th to the 29th, 1952, a series of sightings of unidentified flying objects were reported over Washington, D.C., which later became known as the Washington Flaps, the Washington National Airport sightings, or the invasion of Washington. The best known sightings occurred on 2 consecutive weekends, July the 19th and 20th and July the 26th, 27th. UFO historian Curtis Peebles called the incident the climax in the history of the UFO phenomenon. In a certain sense, this whole affair began with Marilyn Monroe. The actress appeared on the cover of the April 7, 1952 issue of Life magazine, sensual as ever in her low-cut dress and with her seductive gaze. And just above Monroe's left shoulder were the words, "There is a case for interplanetary saucers." This was the last line of an article entitled, "Have We Visitors from Outer Space?" The article examined 10 of the most recent UFO sightings and concluded that they could not be treated as mere mass hallucinations, hoaxes, or land-based craft. An unnamed Air Force intelligence officer was quoted as saying, "The higher you go in the Air Force, the more seriously they take flying saucers." The article concluded with a series of questions. Who or what is aboard them? Where do they come from? Why are they here? What are the intentions of the beings who control them? This was certainly not the first media report of UFOs. There had been much publicity for the notorious 1947 sighting in Roswell, New Mexico. But the Life article marked the first time that a highly popular mainstream magazine had given credence to the theory that UFOs could be alien spacecraft. The story that appeared in Life magazine was big news, which was then carried in more than 350 newspapers across America. Soon, the number of UFO sightings reported to the Air Force skyrocketed. From 23 in March, before the Life article was published, to 82 in April, 79 in May, and 148 in June. Were these increases due to an increase in flying saucers actually flying over the United States, or did the Life story make Americans more likely to report the strange things they saw in the sky? By mid-July, Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, the head of Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO study team, was receiving 40 reports of UFO sightings a day. Many were bogus, but some were from pilots and other respectable citizens, and Ruppelt took them seriously. Then, just days before the first sightings at Washington National Airport, Ruppelt interviewed a government scientist who made a startling prediction that Ruppelt later recorded in his 1956 memoir, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. "Within the next few days," said the unidentified scientist, slapping his hand on his desk for emphasis, "you will have the progenitor of all UFO sightings. The sighting will be in Washington or New York, probably Washington." Sensationally, a few days later, at 11:40 p.m. on Saturday, July the 19th, 1952, Edward Nugent, air traffic controller at Washington National Airport, now Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, sighted 7 objects on his radar. It was a warm, clear, humid night with very little air traffic. The 7 objects were of a purplish colour. Nugent couldn't explain what they were. They certainly weren't planes. The objects were located 15 miles south-southwest of the city. No known aircraft were in the area, and the objects did not follow any established flight paths. They cruised at a slow speed of about 100 to 130 miles per hour. Then they abruptly flew away with an extraordinary increase in velocity. Nugent's superior, Harry Barnes, the airport's air traffic controller, observed the objects on Nugent's radar. Later, in an official note, he wrote that he immediately realized that something very strange was happening. The movements of the objects were completely different than those of normal aircraft, and erratic. In an article for a New York newspaper a few days later, he said that they behaved like a group of kids in the street playing. That is, they seemed to move around, propelled by an innate curiosity. Sometimes they moved in groups, all together, but some maneuvers they performed individually. Barnes had 2 operators check Nugent's radar that evening, who found the equipment was functioning normally. Barnes then called the National Airport Control Tower, also equipped with radar. The controllers, Howard Coughlin and Joe Zacco, said they too had unidentified objects on their radar screens, and that they had seen a bright light hovering in the sky that then flew off with incredible speed. Before the night ended, a pilot reported seeing unexplained objects. Radar at 2 local Air Force bases, Andrews and Bolling, detected the objects, and 2 F-94 Air Force jets scanned the Washington sky, looking for these strange and mysterious flying objects. Barnes also contacted his counterparts at Andrews and Bolling to ask if they too were seeing anything unusual on their radar screens. They said yes, they were getting jamming signals at the same spots mentioned by Barnes. At Andrews, controller William Brady looked out of the control tower window and saw what looked like an orange fireball. It was, he later told Air Force investigators, unlike anything he had ever seen before. At National, Coughlin looked out of the window and saw what he recalls as a whitish blue light emanating from a solid object that was round with no distinguishing marks such as wings, nose or tail. It looked, he says, like a saucer. On one of the runways at National Airport, SC Casey Pierman, a Capital Airlines pilot with 17 years of experience under his belt, was waiting in the cockpit aboard his Capital Airlines 807 for permission to take off. After sighting what he believed to be a meteor, he was told that the control tower's radar had detected unknown objects approaching his position. For the next 14 minutes, as he flew between Herndon and Martinsburg, Pierman observed 6 objects, fast-moving, tailless white lights, sweeping across the sky at an incredible speed. Pierman was in radio contact with Barnes during his sightings, and Barnes later said that each sighting coincided with a signal they could see near his plane. Then Pierman reported that the light was moving away at high speed until it disappeared completely from sight. Sometime later, Pierman gave an interview to a local Washington newspaper in which he added further details to the story of that night, July the 19th, 1952. Pierman said that the object gave off a blindingly bright light, and that when he approached the object while in flight, it veered with such force to create an air vortex that threw him off course. He, of course, immediately reported all of this to his superiors, who told him, "Keep it quiet, whatever it is." Then, as soon as he landed, military bigwigs grabbed him and swore him to secrecy about the whole thing. Pierman was very upset by this. According to him, it is something that cannot be kept secret. It should be revealed to everyone. For years he has tried to do something about it, without, unfortunately, succeeding. Meanwhile, that evening of July the 19th, 1952, At Andrews Air Force Base, control tower personnel were tracking what everyone now believed to be unknown objects on their radar, although some skeptics suspected, but were never able to prove, that they were simply stars and meteors. However, Sergeant Charles Davenport observed an orange-red light to the south. The light appeared to stand still, then abruptly change direction and altitude. This happened several times. The sergeant went on to say, "Later we spotted what appeared to be a star northwest of the camp. It was very bright, but not the same color. This was a bluish silver. It was very erratic in movement, moving from side to side. 3 times I have seen a red object leave the silver object at high speed and move east out of sight." That night, Davenport saw a second set of strange lights. This sighting ended about 3:30 a.m., about half an hour before a commercial pilot, approaching National from the south, called the control tower to signal a light from his port wing. The object was seen on telescopes at both the tower and the ARTC, where a half-lit room glowed lavender from all the radar. When the pilot communicated that the light was going out, the corresponding signals vanished. At one point, both the radar centers at Andrews Air Force Base and National Airport were tracking an object hovering over a radio beacon. The object subsequently disappeared in all radar centers at the same time. The runways at Bolling Air Force Base in Washington were undergoing repairs. Therefore, an F-94 was ordered to leave Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware to investigate the capital's airspace. In a 2 a.m. phone call, an Air Force Command combat officer relayed all the information he had gained to his superiors, but they didn't react at all. The officer persisted, but was not given any news about what he was doing or should do about all these objects flying around Washington. At 3 a.m., just before 2 United States Air Force F-94 Starfire jet fighters from Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware arrived over Washington, all objects disappeared from radar at the National Airport. However, when the jets refueled and took off again, the objects returned, which convinced Barnes that UFOs were monitoring radio traffic and acting accordingly. The objects were last detected by radar at 5:30 in the morning. Barnes analysed the events of that Saturday night in an article he wrote for the New York World Telegram and Sun, published a few days later. He writes that for about 6 hours on the night of July the 19th, July the 20th, there were at least 10 unidentifiable objects flying over Washington. Barnes continues, "I can safely deduce that they performed gyrations which no known aircraft could perform. By this, I mean that our scope showed that they could make right-angled turns and complete reversals of flight. We could detect no pattern to the movement of these objects." No one bothered to call Ruppelt about these sightings. When he flew to Washington a couple of days later on business unrelated to Project Blue Book, he learned about them from reading the papers at the airport. Air Force officials were deeply concerned about one aspect of the sightings. What should they tell the press? No one had any idea what or who flew in the sky above Washington on July the 19th, but the press was demanding answers. The July 19th, 20th, 1952 sightings made headlines across the nation. A typical example is the headline on the Washington Post's front page: "Radar spots air mystery objects here." Coincidentally, US Air Force Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, supervisor of the Air Force's Project Blue Book investigation into UFO sightings, was in Washington at the time. However, he only learned of the sightings on Monday, July the 21st, when he read the headlines in a Washington area newspaper. One such headline, which appeared in the Washington Daily News, read, "Air Force Saucer expert will probe sightings here." Ruppelt then asked his colleagues who the expert cited in the article was. His colleagues replied that it was him. Ruppelt volunteered to spend the night interviewing controllers at the National Airport and the Andrews base, and then report what he learned to the press. But he got caught up in the red tape of military bureaucracy. In fact, he called the Pentagon's transportation section to get a car so he could drive to the various airports. But he was told that only colonels and generals could take cars. So he called two generals, but it was after 4 p.m. and they had already left. Then Ruppelt went to the finance office to get permission to rent a car. "Take a bus," the woman who worked there told him. "It takes a lot of buses to go from the Pentagon to National and then to Andrews," he replied. "Then take a taxi," the woman retorted, "and pay for it with your salary." Ruppelt bitterly replied, "But my per diem is $9, and I also have to pay for room and board." Ruppelt surrendered. "I decided that if flying saucers were buzzing Pennsylvania Avenue, I couldn't care less," he wrote. He took the first available airliner and flew back to Blue Book HQ at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Back in Dayton, Ruppelt spoke with an Air Force radar specialist, Captain Roy James, who believed the unusual weather conditions might have caused the unknown radar targets. A thesis that later turned out to be false. However, later a reporter interviewed Howard Coughlin, Assistant Chief of the Control Tower at Washington National Airport, on duty that evening of July 19, 1952, and one of the first to sight the mysterious flying objects. The reporter asked Coughlin if he had any idea what those objects might be. Coughlin chuckled and then answered curtly and decisively. "I always thought, right from the start, that they were something alien, extraterrestrial, not attributable to anything we know here on Earth, in short, and I will forever continue to be sure of that, no matter what the press or the government says. I was there, I saw it with my own eyes. I will never forget it." At about 10 p.m, Saturday, July the 26th, Ruppelt was at home in Dayton when a reporter called to say that UFOs had returned to the sky above Washington. The reporter asked Ruppelt what the Air Force was going to do about it, and he replied that he had no idea what the Air Force was doing and added that in all likelihood it wasn't doing anything. He hung up, then called the Pentagon and learned that he was right. The Air Force was doing nothing. He made more calls, sending two officers, Major Dewey Fournette and Lieutenant John Holcomb, to National's control tower to see what was going on. US Air Force Major Dewey Fournette, Project Blue Book liaison at the Pentagon, and Lieutenant John Holcomb, US Navy radar specialist, arrived at the National Airport Radar Center in the early hours of July the 27th. They found the controllers following a dozen unexplained signals. An Air Force B-25 was passing through the area, so the controllers directed it to check some of the radar targets. The B-25 went to the location indicated and did not see anything except a tourist boat sailing on the Potomac. During the night, Lieutenant Holcomb received a call from the National Weather Station in Washington. They told him there was a slight temperature inversion over the city, a layer of warm air between two layers of cooler air in the sky, but Holcomb didn't think the inversion was strong enough to explain the radar reports. Fournette reported that everyone in the radar room was convinced that the blips were most likely caused by solid metal objects, not mirages induced by a hypothetical temperature inversion. Andrews radar operators also saw them, and civilian planes flying over Washington reported seeing strange bright objects where the radar was receiving signals. He said there were also weather events on the scope, but these were very common and the controllers didn't pay attention to them. As early as 8:15 p.m. on Saturday, July the 26th, a pilot and stewardess on a national airlines flight to Washington observed lights flying above their plane. Within minutes, both radar centers at the Andrews Air Force Base and the National Airport picked up additional unknown objects. U.S. Air Force Staff Sergeant Charles E. Cummings observed the objects at the Andrews base and later said that these lights did not have the characteristics of shooting stars. There were no trails, and they traveled faster than anything I have ever seen. At 10:23 p.m., as noted in an Air Force report, a sergeant on a radar scope at Andrews noted, "A large number of targets. We observed targets following very erratic courses. Sometimes they seem to stop, then reverse course, accelerate momentarily, and then slow down. The biggest problem seemed to be the large number of targets present, which made it difficult to locate defined targets for control." An Air Force B-29 pilot, cruising at nearly 10,000 feet, observed 3 flashing white objects with amber edges, according to an official Air Force report dated July 31st, 1952, in which his testimony is given. The pilot observed them traveling at approximately the speed of sound, each leaving a yellowish trail. The first object moved across the sky in a horseshoe pattern. The second seemed to fall vertically, and the movement of the third was unidentifiable. Al Chop, the civil public relations officer for Project Blue Book, was in bed with his wife at their home in Alexandria, Virginia, when the phone rang on the evening of July the 26th. They told him that the radars were again signaling the presence of UFOs in the Washington sky. Chop replied that he would be there as soon as possible. And indeed, Chop arrived at the ARTC with his wife, who was afraid to stay home alone, shortly after midnight, joining the radar center staff. "I looked at the radar and there were about 10 to 14 unexplained objects," he said. "They looked like planes. They had the same kind of strong signal, but we couldn't contact them. We just looked at each other as if to say, what should we do? We just saw them. They were there in the sky. We were a little helpless." There were many press officers outside, and for security reasons, Chop denied several reporters' requests to photograph the radar screens. At 11:30 p.m., 2 US Air Force F-94 Starfire jet fighters from Newcastle Air Force Base, Delaware, arrived over Washington. Flight leader Captain John McHugo was directed to radar signals, but saw nothing, despite repeated attempts. However, his wingman, Lieutenant William Patterson, saw 4 white flares and gave chase. He later told investigators that he tried to make contact with the objects below approximately 1,000 feet and that he was flying at top speed, but stopped pursuing them when he realized he had no chance of overtaking them. According to Albert Chop, when ground control asked Patterson if he had seen anything, Patterson replied, "I see them now, and they're all around me. What am I to do?" Nobody answered, because they didn't know what to tell him. When another pair of F-94s were sent to Washington from Newcastle shortly after midnight, something strange happened, even by the standards of what had already happened. The same instant those planes appeared, recalls Chop, the UFOs disappeared. After about 20 minutes, the pilots decided there was nothing they could do about them, so they left. But the moment they left, the UFOs came back. It was the creepiest thing I've ever witnessed in my life. According to Ruppelt's 1956 memoirs, collected in a book entitled The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, which we will discuss later, the signals did not vanish when the jets entered Washington's airspace. Instead, they had moved to Newport News, Virginia. and indeed, Air Force records match Ruppelt's account. Astronomers called the Langley Air Force Base near Newport News with reports of lights popping up in the night sky. An F-94 departed Langley towards the target. After 3 successful lock-ons, he lost it. That's when, according to Ruppelt, the signals came back on Washington's radar. 2 more F-94s from Newcastle Air Force Base were dispatched during the night. One pilot saw nothing unusual. The other saw a white light that vanished when he moved towards it. Civilian aircraft also reported bright objects that matched radar signals seen by Andrews operators. As had happened on July the 20th, the sightings and unknown radar signals ended at dawn. Before the F-94s took off from Newcastle, a Life magazine reporter named Robert Ginner called Ruppelt in Dayton to ask how the Air Force was responding to the latest sightings, but Ruppelt hung up. When the first rays of sunlight announced Sunday morning, the radars were clear of unknown targets. Fournette, Holcomb and Chop went home. The invasion of Washington, D.C. was over. Many years after the events, when reporters asked Chop the same question they had asked Coughlin, what did you think was behind the mysterious objects that appeared on the radar that night, Chop gives almost the same answer. I think we were being visited by someone from another planet. And then he adds, I still think that after all these years. Ruppelt landed again in Washington on Monday afternoon, July the 28th, 1952. The city was abuzz. The evening papers were attacking the Air Force with headlines such as "Fiery objects outrun jets over Capitol. Covert investigation after futile pursuit." Reporters besieged Ruppelt as he checked in at a downtown hotel. The story of UFOs outrunning fighter jets made headlines across America. In Iowa, the headline of the Cedar Rapids Gazette sounded like something out of a science fiction movie. Saucers swarm over Capitol. We have no evidence they are flying saucers, an unidentified Air Force source told reporters. However, we have no evidence that they aren't flying saucers. We don't know what they are. In the absence of factual information, the Washington Daily News published a roundup of rumors. The most persistent rumor was that the saucers were American planes secretly manufactured by Boeing at some remote military site. Another rumor said that the saucers were alien planes that had crashed and then been repaired and flown by the Air Force. That Monday, the Air Force tried to reassure the nation by promising to have fighter jets ready to chase flying saucers at a moment's notice. But that statement did not reassure Robert L. Farnsworth, president of the United States Rocket Society, who warned President Truman not to attack UFOs. If they were extraterrestrials, such actions could lead to the most serious consequences. It would not be smart to wage war on beings with powers far superior to our own. In his cable to Truman, he also stated, friendly contact should be sought as long as possible. The July 26th-27th sightings prompted President Harry Truman to have his aviation aide, Robert B. Landry, call Ruppelt to inquire about the sightings and unknown radar signals. Ruppelt, recalling his conversation with Captain James, told the president's aide that the sightings could have been caused by a temperature inversion, in which a layer of warm, moist air covers a layer of cold, dry air nearer to the ground. This condition can cause radar signals to give false results. However, Ruppelt had not yet questioned any of the witnesses or conducted a formal investigation. And above all, he didn't even believe in this thesis, as he later explained in his book. It was simply a way to not make a bad impression on the President of the United States and avoid being fired. No one knew what those UFOs were, or where they came from, not even Major General John Samford, Director of Air Force Intelligence. But Samford called a press conference at the Pentagon at 4 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon. It was the largest Pentagon press conference since World War II. According to a July 29th memorandum released by the Office of the Inspector General of the Air Force, there wasn't much to say. The memo chastised the Air Force for alimenting reports of the sightings. Much of the publicity was based on Air Force authorized press releases. It read, "The intelligence director advises that there is currently no theory of the origin of the objects and that they are considered unexplainable." Despite this, Samford ignored the memorandum and still decided to call a press conference, which, however, turned out to be one of the usual embarrassing attempts to cover up the truth by the US administration. He arrived at room 3E869 at exactly 4 p.m, accompanied by Ruppelt and several other officials. He opened with a rambling monologue on the history of UFOs, which, he noted, dates back as far as biblical times. He mentioned the UFO sightings that occurred in 1846, but never got to the UFO sightings of 1952, which were the ones for which the press conference was called. When asked by reporters about the Washington sightings, Samford related a story about a Japanese radar that had picked up a flock of ducks in 1950. When asked if National's and Andrews radars had seen the same signals simultaneously, he philosophized about the definition of the word simultaneously. When asked if UFOs could be material objects, he pondered the definition of the word material. When asked if the F-94 pilot who chased the strange light was a qualified military pilot, he questioned what the word qualified meant. Then, speaking about what the pilot saw, Samford uttered a sentence that ought to have a place in the bureaucratic gibberish Hall of Fame. That very likely is one that sits apart and says insufficient measurement, insufficient association with other things, insufficient association with other probabilities, for it to do any more than to join that group of sightings that we still hold in front of us as saying no. During the lecture, Samford also mentioned the temperature inversion theory, that suggests a layer of warm air in the sky could have caused the radar to make mistakes. They are called inversions because the air temperature normally decreases at a regular rate as altitude increases. However, it can happen that at important heights, anomalous pockets of heat are formed, which act as mirrors for the radars, deflecting the signals towards the ground. When the rays of this signal reach the Earth, bouncing off a building or a truck for example, the radars are induced to perceive as if these objects were in the sky, where the anomalous pocket of heat would be. Initially, he said that this thesis of temporal inversion to explain the UFOs over Washington was a possibility. Later, he specified that it was 50-50. Finally, he said that it was only a probable explanation. He spoke until 5:20 p.m, and then the reporters rushed back to their offices and settled, all of them, on the temperature inversion theory. It was evidently an irresistible concept to journalists. The UFOs, they wrote, were caused by Washington's famous hot air, though Life ran a story that August suggesting the Air Force had known more about the signals than it's admitting. Ruppelt was amazed. Samford hadn't really explained anything, but whatever he had done, it had worked. Somehow, Ruppelt wrote in his book, out of this chaotic situation came exactly the result that was expected. The press got out of the way. As a result, when newspapers stopped reporting about UFOs, people stopped reporting about UFOs. Reports dropped from 50 a day to 10 a day in just 1 week, and the UFOs never returned to the sky above Washington. Among the witnesses who supported Samford's explanation were the crew of a B-25 bomber, which had flown over Washington during the July 26th-27th sightings. The bomber was directed several times by National Airport towards targets, unknown to airport radars, but the crew could see nothing unusual. Finally, as one crew member recounted, the radar had a target which turned out to be the Wilson Line steamboat travelling to Mount Vernon. The radar was definitely picking up the steamboat. Air Force Captain Harold May was at the radar center at Andrews Base during the July 19th and 20th sightings. Upon learning that the National Airport's radar had detected an unknown object heading in his direction, May stepped outside and saw a light that went from red to orange to green to red again. Sometimes it suddenly dipped and seemed to lose height. However, May eventually concluded that he was simply seeing a star distorted by the atmosphere and that its movement was an illusion. At 3 AM on July the 27th, an Eastern Airlines flight over Washington was notified that an unknown object was in its vicinity, but the crew could see nothing unusual. When they were told the object had moved directly behind their aircraft, they began a sharp turn to try to see the object, but were told by the National Airport Radar Center that the object had disappeared when they started to turn. Almost a year after the Pentagon press conference, in May 1953, the CAA released a report that was supposed to close the case on the sightings. It concluded that the unidentified radar signals do not represent new phenomena, nor are they unique to the Washington area. The report argued that temperature inversions often drift due to wind, giving the illusion of moving targets on radars. It also devoted a couple of sentences to explain the corresponding visual sightings. It should be noted that sudden temperature reversals overhead can refract light in much the same way as radar waves and produce mirage effects. CAA investigators had interviewed Coughlin on the first Saturday night of the sightings. They were very careful to discount anything that we had to say, Coughlin remembers, so we just kept quiet. As I recall, we saw several things that night, but made no mention of them because they just kept laughing at us. We didn't particularly care for it. Oddly, the CAA report drew on weather data from August the 13th and 14th, 1952, and not from the 2 July weekends that sent UFOs to the top of the CIA's priority list. Previous sightings had usually involved small numbers of observers. In January 1948, a pilot with the Kentucky Air National Guard on a low-altitude training flight from Georgia to Kentucky chased what he thought was a flying saucer until he reached around 25,000 feet. Then he fainted from lack of oxygen and his plane spiraled back to Earth, breaking up completely before it got there. Later that year, another Air National Guard pilot entered a dogfight with what he claimed was a UFO over Fargo, North Dakota. It had him flying so fast that he temporarily blacked out. CIA historian Gerald Haines, in his 1997 memoirs on CIA involvement in UFO affairs, also mentions Truman's concern. A massive accumulation of sightings over the United States in 1952, especially in July, alarmed the Truman administration. On July the 19th and 20th, radars at Washington National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base picked up mysterious blips. Then, July 27th, the blips reappeared. The CIA allegedly reacted to the 1952 wave of UFO reports by forming a special study group within the Office of Scientific Intelligence, OSI, and the Office of Current Intelligence, OCI, to look into the situation. Edward Taus reported for the group that most UFO sightings could easily be explained. Nonetheless, he recommended that the agency continue to monitor the problem. Due to the tense Cold War situation and the increased Soviet technological and military capabilities, the CIA study group saw serious national security problems in dealing with the flying saucer situation. The group believed that the Soviets could use UFO reports to trigger mass hysteria and panic in the United States. The group also believed that the Soviets could use UFO sightings to overload the United States airborne warning system so that it could not distinguish real targets from phantom UFOs. CIA concern over the matter would lead to the January 1953 creation of the Robertson Panel. CIA Assistant Director Chadwell and Robertson, a well-known physicist at the California Institute of Technology, assembled a distinguished group of non-military scientists to study the UFO question. It included Robertson as president, Samuel A. Goudsmit, nuclear physicist at Brookhaven National Laboratories, Luis Alvarez, a high-energy physicist, Thornton Page, Deputy Director of the Johns Hopkins Operations Research Office and expert on radar and electronics, and Lloyd Berkner, Director of Brookhaven National Laboratories and geophysics specialist. The group unanimously concluded that there was no evidence of a direct threat to national security in the UFO sightings. Nor could the panel find any evidence that the objects cited could be extraterrestrial. Nor, however, was it able to prove otherwise. It found that continued emphasis on UFO reporting could threaten the orderly functioning of government by clogging communication channels with irrelevant reports and inducing hysterical mass behavior which would be harmful to established authority. The panel also feared that potential enemies contemplating an attack on the US could exploit UFO phenomena and use them to disrupt US air defenses. To attempt to address these problems and prevent others from occurring, the Commission recommended that the National Security Council debunk UFO reports and institute a public education policy to reassure the public about the lack of evidence behind UFOs. It suggested using mass media, advertising, corporate clubs, schools, and even the Disney Corporation to get the message across. A veritable cabal to carry out a mass cover-up and mind control of American citizens. The panel also recommended that UFO groups such as the Civilian Flying Saucer Investigators in Los Angeles and the Organization for Aerial Phenomena Research in Wisconsin be monitored for subversive activity. As mentioned, at the request of the Air Force, the CAA's Technical Development and Evaluation Center analyzed the 2 weekend July radar sightings over Washington in 1952. Their conclusion was that a temperature inversion had been indicated in nearly all cases in which unidentified radar targets or visual objects were reported. Project Blue Book would eventually label Washington's unknown radar blips as false images caused by temperature inversion, and visual sightings as misidentified meteors, stars, and city lights. In later years, 2 prominent UFO skeptics, Donald Menzel, a Harvard University astronomer, and Philip Klass, senior editor of Aviation Week magazine, would also support the temperature inversion mirage hypothesis. Klass told a reporter in 2002 that radar technology in 1952 was not sophisticated enough to filter out many ordinary objects, such as flocks of birds, weather balloons, or temperature inversions. The reporter added that UFO supporters argue that even then experienced controllers could distinguish between spurious targets and solid metal objects. Klass disagrees. Maybe we had 2 stupid controllers at National Airport on those nights. Klass added that the introduction of digital filters in the 1970s led to a sharp decline in UFO sightings on radar. In his book, written many years after the events in Washington, Edward J. Ruppelt wrote that the radar and control tower personnel he spoke with, as well as some Air Force officers, disagreed with the explanation given by the Air Force and Sanford. Michael Wertheimer, researcher for the government-funded Condon report, investigated the case in 1966 and said radar witnesses continue to dispute the Air Force explanation. Former radar controller Howard Coughlin told the Washington Post in 2002 that he still believes he saw an object, saying he's sure he saw it first on the radar screen and then out of the window, above Washington National Airport. In fact, as amply demonstrated, we know for sure that the truth about the events in Washington has been denied to us for a long time up to now. One of the main protagonists of the whole affair, Edward Ruppelt, head of the government Blue Book project, wrote a book precisely to help us citizens better understand not only the so-called invasion of Washington, but the UFO phenomenon in general. The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects is a 1956 book by retired Air Force UFO investigator Edward J. Ruppelt, detailing his experience managing Project Blue Book. Ruppelt was a US Air Force captain who served as director of the official UFO investigations, Project Grudge and Project Blue Book. During his time as director, he himself coined the term UFO. Project Grudge was a short-lived US Air Force project to investigate unidentified flying objects. Grudge succeeded Project Sign in February 1949 and was then followed by Project Blue Book. The project formally ended in December 1949, but continued in minimal capacity until the end of 1951. Project Grudge was intended to alleviate public anxiety about UFOs and persuade the public that UFOs did not constitute anything unusual or extraordinary. UFO sightings have been explained as balloons, conventional aircraft, planets, meteors, optical illusions, solar flares, or even major hail. On December 27, 1949, the Air Force announced the end of the project. However, astronomer and ufologist J. Allen Hynek criticized Project Grudge, arguing that the project was less science and more of a public relations campaign. Project Grudge also received criticism from former intelligence officer Edward J. Ruppelt, who was convinced of the alien nature of UFOs and how he saw the US military and government trying to discredit the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Hynek and Ruppelt argued that Project Grudge was as far from possible from an objective scientific examination of the phenomenon. In the foreword, Ruppelt argues, "It has been common knowledge that ever since the first flying saucer was reported in June 1947, the Air Force has officially stated that there is no evidence for the existence of such a thing as interplanetary spacecraft. Yet, I know for certain that this conclusion is far from unanimous among the military and their scientific advisors." Between 1947 and 1969, the United States Air Force directed a series of projects aimed at revealing the true nature of UFOs. Project Sign, the first of these investigations, sought to discover whether or not these reported observations posed a threat to national security. Since the answer was no, in the numerous subsequent projects, UFOs became objects of scientific interest. Expert scientists from nearly all fields of science were hired to identify the true cause of the observations. Around the world, the scientific community split into three camps regarding the nature and existence of unidentified flying objects. There were the hardline skeptics and non-believers, the cautious, curious, and the true believers, who, in UFO testimony, sought evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. But within the confines of federally funded UFO investigations, scientists have searched for all possible explanations of UFO phenomena, from physical to psychological. In more than 80% of the tens of thousands of cases examined by Air Force programs, the cause has been identified in physical phenomena, but there remain 20% of cases for which the conclusion has been made unknown. In most cases, real phenomena fuel UFO reports, be it airplanes, meteors, weather phenomena, or real physical objects. But what about those reports that are eventually classified as unknown? Astronomer J. Allen Hynek argued in 1952 that it would be foolish to suggest that all physical phenomena that exist have been discovered. Ruppelt begins the first chapter with a short story set in the summer of 1952, in which an unnamed F-86 fighter pilot fires on an unidentified target, only to be ridiculed as going crazy or panicking. Ruppelt claims the incident report was burned and was never submitted to Project Blue Book, and further claims he only learned of the incident through informal channels. Ruppelt describes how Blue Book handled incoming UFO reports. Many stories were classified as insufficient data to evaluate, but a crackpot file contained reports of people who had talked to flying saucer crews, who had inspected flying saucers that had landed in the United States, who had traveled in flying saucers, or were members of flying saucer crews. Reports considered potentially good and reliable were those from trusted and trained observers, such as senior military personnel. Ruppelt goes on to describe briefings given to students at the Air Force Command and Staff School, the Air Force Intelligence School, the Office of Naval Research, as well as the Atomic Energy Commission's Los Alamos Laboratory and Sandia Air Force Base. Ruppelt points out the discrepancy between public denials of official interest around the same time his groups were actively studying UFOs. All this time, unnamed Air Force officials have denied serious interest in the UFO topic. Yet, every time a reporter went out to interview a person who had seen a UFO, the Secret Service agents had already flown in, obtained the detailed story, complete with sketches of the UFO, and hurried back to their base to send the report to Project Sign. Many people had been warned not to talk too much. The Air Force was very interested in the matter. The second chapter, The Era of Confusion Begins, discusses the Arnold sighting and the subsequent flying saucer craze of 1947. This craze was a wave of reports of unidentified flying objects in the United States that were published in the summer of that year. The craze kicked off on June the 24th, when media outlets across the nation carried the story of civilian pilot Kenneth Arnold witnessing saucer-shaped objects that headlines dubbed flying saucers. Such news quickly spread throughout the United States. Historians would later report at least 800 copycat testimonials in the following weeks, while other sources estimate the testimonials may have numbered in the thousands. Reports peaked on July the 7th. After numerous hoaxes and misidentifications, saucer reports largely subsided by July the 10th. Popular sources speculated that the saucer reports were caused by new technology, misidentifications, or mass hysteria. Conversely, fringe speculation argued that the saucers could have come from other planets or other dimensions. Still others suggested that the saucers were occult or could mean the end of the world. The 1947 craze has been extensively studied in both folklore and religious studies, where it is regarded by scholars as the birth of a modern myth. After initial skepticism, sightings by military personnel attracted the attention of the Air Force Technical Intelligence Center. Ruppelt explains that, As more UFOs were observed near the Air Force's Muroc Test Center, the Army's White Sands Proving Ground, and atomic bomb facilities, ATIC's efforts became more focused. Ruppelt described the Maury Island incident, in which original saucer witness Kenneth Arnold obtained stones resembling lava rocks, which he claimed came from flying saucers. Arnold contacted Air Force investigators, who flew in to investigate. While returning home, the two investigators died when their plane suffered an engine problem. The report on unidentified flying objects was the first book to reveal that on September 23, 1947, Lieutenant General Nathan Twining had issued a memo to Brigadier General George Shulgin of the Army Air Forces. The subject line of the memo read, "AMC opinion concerning flying discs." The general tone of the memo was that the unidentified objects seen in the skies by military personnel were not meteorological, astronomical, or other phenomena, but rather objects that merited further investigation. Twining wrote, "The phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious." The third chapter, The Classics, analyzes the three most important reports of 1948. The Mantell incident, in which a National Guard pilot died while chasing a UFO. The Charles Whitted incident, in which airline pilots reported a near collision with a UFO. And Gorman's dogfight, in which a National Guard pilot engaged a UFO. Ruppelt talks about alleged incidents at Oak Ridge and Hanford, both major US atomic facilities. Ruppelt also discusses a report from Germany, dated November 23, 1948, which marked the first report featuring visual contact while simultaneously being picked up on radar. The fourth chapter, Green Fireballs, Project Twinkle, Little Lights, and Grudge, contains descriptions of the green fireballs first sighted over New Mexico in November 1948. They may have been ordinary meteorites, psychologically magnified rockets, or real UFOs, but whatever they were playing around in one of the most sensitive security areas in the United States. Ruppelt reports that a conference was convened at Los Alamos in February 1949. In the summer of 1949, the Air Force's Cambridge Research Laboratories set up Project Twinkle to attempt to photograph these objects, but to no avail. Ruppelt's book was the first to reveal the existence of Project Sign. Ruppelt also claimed that Sign had produced an estimate of the situation, which endorsed an interplanetary explanation for UFOs, but General Hoyt Vandenberg, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, shut down Project Sign for lack of proof. Historian of folklore Curtis Peebles described the estimate as the most controversial document in the early history of the flying saucer myth. In the wake of the report, top Air Force officials denied the estimate ever existed. No copy of this document or any other corroboration of Ruppelt's claim has been produced. Popular mechanics called the report probably more mythological than real. Chapter 5, The Dark Ages, describes the shift from Project Sign to Project Grudge, beginning February the 11th, 1949. Ruppelt charges that standard intelligence procedures were no longer being used by Project Grudge. Everything was being evaluated on the premise that UFOs couldn't exist. No matter what you see or hear, don't believe it. Ruppelt alleged that some charter members of Project Sign had been purged. These were the people who had refused to change their original opinions about UFOs. Chapter 6, The Press's Role, the Air Force Shrugs, describes how increasing public reporting of UFOs was met with relative indifference by the Air Force, who continued to maintain that such objects did not exist. Chapter 7, The Pentagon Rumbles, discusses the publication of Frank Scully's book Behind the Flying Saucers, with its tales of the Aztec, New Mexico UFO hoax. After a Life magazine article, official interest in UFOs begins to climb again. Chapter 8, The Lubbock Lights Unabridged, discusses the Lubbock Lights incident of September 1951. In Chapter 9, The New Project Grudge, Air Force investigators partner with civilian researchers to improve UFO reporting and investigation. Ruppelt argues that UFOs were seen more frequently around areas vital to the defense of the United States. The Los Alamos Albuquerque area, Oak Ridge, and White Sands Proving Ground rated high. Port areas, strategic air command bases, and industrial areas ranked next. The frequency of the UFO reports was interesting. Every July there was a sudden increase in the number of reports, and July was always the peak month of the year. Just before Christmas there was usually a minor peak. Chapter 10, Project Blue Book and the Big Build-Up, describes Ruppelt's activities during the first months of 1952, including a Life magazine article titled "Have We Visitors from Outer Space?" Chapter 11, The Big Flap, discusses the UFO wave of summer 1952, culminating in the Washington, D.C. UFO incident. Chapter 12, The Washington Merry-Go-Round, describes official reactions to the D.C. incident, culminating in General Sanford's press conference, which we have dealt with during this documentary. Chapter 13, Hoax or Horror, describes Ruppelt's investigation of a Boy Scout leader allegedly burned and rendered unconscious by a UFO. In Chapter 14, Digesting the Data, Ruppelt describes plans to observe UFOs during the H-bomb tests in the Pacific and a proposal for visual spotting stations in northern New Mexico. Chapter 15, The Radiation Story, examines a supposed link between UFOs and radiation. Chapter 16, The Hierarchy Ponders, describes the composition of the final report. In the 17th and final chapter, What Are UFOs?, Ruppelt opines, "I wouldn't want to hazard a guess as to what the final outcome of the UFO investigation will be, but I am sure that within a few years there will be a proven answer." The book concludes, "Maybe the first proven answer will be that all of the UFOs that have been reported are merely misidentified known objects. Or maybe the many pilots, radar specialists, generals, industrialists, scientists, and the man on the street who have told me I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't seen it myself, knew what they were talking about. Maybe the Earth is being visited by interplanetary spaceships. Only time will tell." 4 years after the original publication, Ruppelt released a new edition with 3 additional chapters. In these, Ruppelt seemed to have changed course, declaring UFOs to be a space-age myth. In the first chapter, And They're Still Flying, Ruppelt covered the late 1950s sightings in Ohio, Colorado, and Kansas. Ruppelt discusses the formation of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, a non-profit organization established to investigate UFO reports, and his subsequent testimony before the United States Senate Committee on Government Operations. In the second new chapter, Off They Go Into the Wild Blue Yonder, Ruppelt details George Adamski's wild stories of repeatedly traveling to Venus aboard a flying saucer, likening Adamski to P.T. Barnum. In the final chapter, Do They or Don't They?, Ruppelt responds to the question, "Do unidentified flying objects exist?" with the answer, "I'm positive they don't." Why did Ruppelt change his mind so drastically in just 4 years? Did someone from the government or the military force him to do so? The book has been called the most significant of its era. The Buffalo News covered the book under the headline, "You Saw a Spaceship, Air Force Won't Deny It," writing, Ruppelt reports their conclusion as one of rejection of the theory that the objects are spaceships, on the grounds that there is no definite proof. A 1956 review described the report as the sober reporting of a man who was in charge of one of the official investigations, arguing that Ruppelt never advances an explanation of what is inexplicable. In the 1970s, UFO researcher J. Allen Hynek suggested that Ruppelt's book should be required reading for anyone seriously interested in the history of the subject. Historian Curtis Peebles concludes that the book should have ended the speculation about an Air Force cover-up. In fact, Ruppelt's statements were converted into support for the cover-up idea. In the same year of the book's release, 1956, a documentary was released with the same title, inspired by Ruppelt's text. Clips from the documentary have often been used in other UFO documentaries and television programs. In 1952, Hollywood producer Clarence Green saw an unusual object twisting in the sky. He decided to report the sighting and contacted US Air Force Public Information Officer Albert M. Chopp, who was in charge of answering UFO questions from reporters and the public. Intrigued by his experience, Green decided to film a documentary movie about the UFO phenomenon. When Chopp told Green about the existence of film footage of UFOs, Green obtained the footage for analysis and display in his documentary. The film begins with a statement about its genre. Many times in the history of our civilization, the introduction of a new thought has brought skepticism, even ridicule. Despite this, there has always remained the duty and inalienable right to tell the people the truth. The motion picture you are about to see is true. It is not fiction. Much of the information in it has never been told. You will see it here for the first time. The documentary starts in 1947 with the first widely publicized UFO sightings in the United States, including recreations of the Kenneth Arnold UFO sighting, the Mantell UFO incident, and the Gorman dogfight. It then traces the development of UFOs as both a popular fad and a serious concern for the US Air Force. The history of Project Sign, the first Air Force study of the UFO phenomenon, is discussed. The documentary then focuses upon protagonist Albert M. Chopp, who is assigned as the Public Information Officer at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio in the late 1940s. In that position, he is required to answer numerous news media queries about UFO sightings and what the Air Force knows about them. Chopp interviews a German rocket scientist, formerly of Penemunde's V-2 program, now working for America. The scientist lends credence to the possibility that UFOs exist. Although he is initially portrayed as a UFO debunker, Chopp gradually changes his views as the movie progresses, and he comes to believe that UFOs are unknown and possibly extraterrestrial aircraft. By 1952, Chopp has moved to Washington, D.C., where he is the press spokesman for Project Blue Book. The documentary analyzes two famous pieces of UFO footage. The Mariana UFO incident of 1950, in which the manager of the Great Falls, Montana minor league baseball team claimed to have filmed two UFOs flying over the local baseball stadium. And the 1952 UFO film taken near the Great Salt Lake in Utah by a US Navy photographer, Delbert Newhouse. The documentary concludes with the famous 1952 Washington, D.C. UFO incident, in which Albert Chopp played a central role. The documentary recreates Chopp's experiences during the incident, and at the end of the documentary, Chopp states his belief that UFOs are a real physical phenomenon of unknown origin.